Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. We have a very large call as usual. We have over 1,600 people registered. And I can see we've got about 500 people on already. I'm going to give it a couple minutes to allow more people to join before we get started. So we'll get started in a couple minutes. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes to allow people to join. We have a very large call. As always, we have about 700 people on the line already, and we have over 1,600 people registered. So I'll give it another couple minutes to allow more people to join before we get started. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. I'm going to give it about one more minute before we get started. We have about 800 people on the line and expecting still many more. So I'm going to give it a little bit more time for more to join, and we'll get started soon. Thanks. Okay, hi everybody. This is Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining today's call on coronavirus, disasters, housing, and homelessness. As always, we have a very large call. We have over 900 people on the line already, with many more joining. We have about 1,600 people registered for today's call. So I want to thank you all for taking time during such a busy time to join this call, to hear updates and share updates on the latest on coronavirus disasters, housing, and homelessness. And we have a number of really important and exciting guest speakers. And we are working now to connect with our first. So while we do, I want to start to share a few updates. We have many updates to share on today's call related to recent and upcoming executive and other actions by the Biden administration that are impacting low-income renters and people who are experiencing homelessness. So the first that I'll mention is the extension of the eviction moratorium, which President Joe Biden last week signed on his first day in office, an executive order to extend that eviction moratorium as we urged him to do. So that's very good news. What he did was direct the new director of the CDC to extend the eviction moratorium through at least March. And on that same day, on January 20th, the CDC director put out a statement saying that she intends to do just that. She said, as a protective public health measure, I will extend the current order temporarily halting residential evictions until at least March 31st, 2021. So of course, that's excellent news. The eviction moratorium was set to expire on January 31st. And as you all well know, there were tens of millions of renters who would have been at risk of losing their homes at that time. So we're very appreciative for President Biden taking that action on his first day in office. I will say too that many of us are waiting eagerly to see that executive order published in the Federal Register, and it has not been published yet. We're certainly keeping our eye out for it, and as soon as we have it, we will share it very broadly through our email networks to share it with all of you. Hasn't been published yet, but I expect it will be anytime. And then we will also expect for the CDC director to put out something to codify that executive order and her intention to extend the eviction moratorium. So a couple other things on that. Of course, you all know very well that while extending the eviction moratorium is essential, on its own, it's insufficient to keep low-income renters stably housed during the pandemic because of all the flaws that exist in the current CDC order. And of course, we've talked about those flaws at length on these calls, but you all know that there are an alarming number of evictions that are proceeding despite the CDC eviction moratorium being in place. And that's why many of you and others joined us. We had over 2,000 organizations sign a letter to President Biden, urging him to not only extend, but also to strengthen and improve and enforce the eviction moratorium. So I spoke with a couple of people from the White House the night before and the day of the signing of the executive order, and was told by them that they understand that there is a need for some improvements. There is a need for changes. And what they want to do next is open a process to allow for input on the types of improvements that are needed in the eviction moratorium. So we have sent a letter, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, together with the National Housing Law Project, sent a letter to the new CDC director, asking her, congratulating her on her new position, thanking her for taking this first step, and asking her for a meeting as soon as possible to start to talk about the urgent improvements and enforcement mechanisms that are needed for this order. So I am hopeful that we will connect with her soon. I know from speaking with some of her staff too, that they are well aware of needed improvements to this. So I do think we'll have to keep pushing just to make sure that this stays at the top of their list of urgent priorities, because clearly the CDC has many right now. But we will push to have a meeting and a discussion as soon as possible to give input on those improvements that we need to see. So I'm going to pause there for just a second because I just want to check in and see where we are with our speakers. Um, sorry, bear with me for just a moment. Okay, so it looks like we're trying to connect and get Representative Maxine Waters all set for this call, but we do now have Senator Mark Warner on the line. So I am really pleased to introduce Senator Warner. He is the senior senator from Virginia. He is serving his third term in the Senate, where he serves on a number of powerful committees, including the Finance Committee, the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, the Budget Committee. And during his time in the Senate, he has established himself as a bipartisan leader, working with both Republicans and Democrats on solutions. And in fact, he was part of the bipartisan group that came together to negotiate the COVID relief package last year. And Senator Warner, as part of that bipartisan group, he was really leading the negotiations on the housing provisions, where he staunchly negotiated for and helped secure the $25 billion in rental assistance and the extended CDC eviction moratorium. So Senator Warner, we're so grateful for your leadership and your commitment to the housing stability of low-income renters. And I really appreciate you joining today's call, and I'll turn it over to you for your remarks, Senator Warner.
Hello.
Hi, Senator Warner, is that you?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining today's call.
Well, thank you, Diane. And I know there's been some, I guess, technical difficulties with Chair Waters, and I imagine she will be joining after I'm done now, and want to commend her great work on this topic. I'm glad we've got so many advocates on the call today, and especially those of you from Virginia, and the incredibly important work that you all continue to do to make sure that low-income families have access to safe and affordable housing. Well, obviously so many of you have been working on this issue for years, and I know back to my days as governor, something that I focused on, frankly, back in the early 2000s. I know you've been in the trenches for a long, long time, but I do think one of the things that the pandemic has shown is that that Americans' access to safe and affordable housing has been a problem that's been with us for many, many years, but really has been exacerbated by the COVID-19. And one of the things I hope that we're able to do is provide both fixes for the short term, but also finally start thinking about and putting in place long-term structural changes. In terms of the short run, I was very proud of the fact that during the last round of the COVID negotiations, I worked with Senator Collins, and with great assistance from Chair Waters and folks like Sherrod Brown, who had the original legislation, to try to get in $25 billion in emergency resources to low-income renters that allowed millions to stay in their homes past the otherwise December 31st deadline, where we would have started the evictions. I think this, while we wanted more than the $25 billion, this was actually an area on a relative basis compared to our asks. We were able to convince our Republican colleagues to meet us most of the way there, not as much we'd hoped, but again, it was probably the largest new initiative in the whole COVID package. That $25 billion, as you know, was part of a $900 billion package that, again, unfortunately, the former president took weeks messing around with before he signed it on December 27th. And while those dollars are getting out now, they've been delayed a couple of key critical weeks. But I think, at least I felt like that $900 billion package, while the second largest relief package in the history of our country, literally second only to the first CARES package, that it was only a bridge for the next 3 months. So I'm happy to see that President Biden has put out his new initiative. And while I may have some concerns with certain component parts, one of the things that I'm very supportive of in the Biden next initiative is his additional $25 billion in rental assistance. I think it is extraordinarily important. I know that doesn't get us 100% whole, since we were talking about $70 billion in back rents, but it will take us, I think, a long way down that path. I'd also like to see additional resources go into the emergency solutions grants, as well as funding for housing choice vouchers. I know something that you guys, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, have worked on for some time. I also think one of the things that I hope that will be in this coming package, whether the first one or the second one, is continuation on the unemployment safety net for those gig workers and other part-time and occasional workers that previously were not included in unemployment. I want to see the expansion of our child tax credit and earned income tax credit. Again, good work that Michael Bennett and Sherrod Brown have continued to do. So we need to make sure that we've got a safety net in place on an ongoing basis. One thing I also want to add here is something I hope to, I've been working on for some time, literally around a future of work initiative that started back in 2017 at the Aspen Institute. But I think with work in this country, from your first dollar you make in any kind of job, there ought to be benefits included. And those benefits ought to be portable and allow you to move from gig to gig, job to job, part-time, independent contracting, you name it. And there ought to be benefits and they ought to be portable. So something that I think we need to weave together to really create a 21st century safety net to meet workers where they're at. Finally, as a member of the banking committee, I do want us to think about long-term solutions to the housing crisis in this country. That means more funding and sustainable funding for the Housing Trust Fund that will allow then states and localities to think more comprehensively about how to increase housing supply. I mean, as you all know better than I, the amount of truly low-income housing new construction remains remarkably low to non-existent. Finding ways to further assist with down payments and financing for first-time home buyers, particularly those of color. And it's one of the reasons why, we might not have fully all agreed on every component of housing finance reform on Fannie and Freddie. I continue to believe since we're having a more explicit government guarantee on most mortgages in this country, that every mortgage that has any level of government guarantee ought to have a 10 to 15 basis point fee that is collected that would provide long-term sustainable housing, sustainable funding, roughly in the neighborhood of $6 billion a year that could go into the Housing Trust Fund and other related programs to assist not only home buyers, but also renters. I think, again, we've got a rare opportunity now with folks who I think focus on housing, with Democrats in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. I hope we can work with low-income housing coalition advocates and enterprises to make sure that we take advantage of this, and whether it comes with housing finance or long-term rental assistance, that we think beyond just COVID, but think about long-term structural changes. That's why I wanted to mention the portable benefits and the series of other initiatives that I hope to go through and lay out over the coming months. So Diane, recognizing that we're kind of moving around, why don't I go ahead and stop there if you'd like, and be happy to take a couple questions, or I don't know if, I know we were gonna go ahead and have a question and answer period. Do you still want to do that, or do you want to move over to? Okay.
Yes. If you have time, I would love to ask you a question or two.
Sure, absolutely.
Great, and thank you, Senator Warner, for those remarks. Couldn't agree more about the importance of everything you laid out. Another $30 billion in rent and utility assistance, more money for ESG, more money for housing choice vouchers. And just again to say how much we appreciate all of your work and leadership in getting the housing and homelessness assistance dollars in the first two packages. So I know that you have worked hard to come to bipartisan solutions, and I think you were part of the bipartisan group that met with the White House over the weekend or last week to
Yes.
start to talk about a path towards the next COVID relief package. So can you share any reflections from that call, or how likely you think it is that we can get to bipartisan agreement on a COVID relief package at the scale that's needed?
I think it's a great question, Diane, and I was on a call and with a number of the Brian Deese and other folks from the Biden administration, and I think it was good that the administration reached out to this group. I think our success in the $900 billion package that was signed in December, in terms of breaking the log jam, that $900 billion was terribly important. It would have been even more important if we could have gotten it out in September or October when the needs were already in existence, number one. Number two, before I get to the administration and the tenor of the conversation, number two, I think our success in December, nothing works in the Senate like success breeding success. We've expanded our group to 16 now, and we have not a waiting list per se, but a number of other senators from both parties who want to be part of this group that's about getting things done. That's the good news. The challenge, and this is what I think the administration needs to do, is one, I think we need to hear from economists and others across the board, ideological spectrum, from progressive to conservative, to continue to make the point, which I firmly agree with, that the economy needs more stimulus now. The challenge for people who don't follow this day in and day out is you've got a record high stock market. You have many states actually not having the revenue losses that were projected in September and October. So continuing to make the base case that I know you guys deal with every day, that there is more need for stimulus now, is terribly important, number one. Number two, I think we need better data that demonstrates that how much of the money has actually been distributed from the December 27th package. Again, $900 billion, only the CARES package is bigger than that. That $900 billion in December was bigger than the relief, the TARP package. The relief package is out after the 2008 crisis. So I think showing that those dollars are getting out, and some of the ones that have not gotten out, like the PPP money, is soon to be distributed. Number three, I think we can make, I think there was broad-based bipartisan agreement about things like vaccine distribution, PPE. I think we have a very strong case to make about continued rental assistance. So I feel pretty good on those areas. I do think there are some questions being raised in terms of prioritization, for example, about folks who are at the higher levels of income, whether getting an additional $1,400 check, if the trade-off is cutting off people's unemployment, whether that's a valid check. I know some people think there's unlimited funding. If we have an unlimited funding, this wouldn't be a problem, but if we are going to have to make fiscal choices, I think there is a question around, because there is a case under the current formula where a family of five could make over $300,000 in income and still be receiving a check. Somehow that family getting a check overextending increased unemployment, particularly for gig workers, for an additional month or two. I think that's a fair debate to have. And, I also know on the state and local number, and I say this as a former governor, I'm a huge advocate of state and local government funding, but the discrepancy between those states and localities that have really been hit hard and those who have not been hit as hard is really pretty dramatic. And some of the numbers in the Biden proposal, I think, need a little bit of scrubbing. I'll just point out that in Virginia, we had projected a $1.3 billion shortfall for this fiscal year. We're on the path to actually having a positive surplus rather than that $1.3 billion shortfall. That was, we may be unique because we've got strong defense and we've got strong tech, but a number of states did not have the level of hit that we anticipated. So I think if we can target some of those dollars. For example, if we could reallocate $80 billion that was potentially in some of these checks, we could provide broadband for every family in America. That might be a valid trade-off. So I think there is, I'm giving you a slightly longer answer, Diane, because it's complicated. And I know you guys follow this closely, but I think we need to continue to make the economic case that additional stimulus is needed now, and I'm supportive of that. I think the rental assistance is an easier deliverable than some of the other areas. On some of the other areas, we may just need to have some back and forth about better targeting. I do think a number of our Republican friends, though, could be supportive for a package that might be amended.
Well, that's good to hear, Senator Warner. I appreciate that, those details, and to know that you feel confident that or relatively confident that we can make a strong case for the additional funding for rental assistance, because certainly we do have the data to support that, as well as the data to support the need for housing choice vouchers and funding for homeless shelter and service providers and acquisition dollars. So we're certainly at the ready to get you whatever you need to be able to make as strong a case as possible, and will be.
Yeah, and let me just quickly add, please get that to my staff. I think again, just resumming what I just said, but the focus were on some of the larger item tickets, right, rather than the housing vouchers and the rental assistance.
Right. Yes, we will. And if I could ask you one more question about
sure.
what after the COVID relief package, assuming we get either a bipartisan or in some way we get a COVID relief package passed, and President Biden made clear his intention, and I think that the Democrats in the House and the Senate have do a major infrastructure stimulus package. How do you think we best make the case that housing is infrastructure, and how do we work together to make sure that kind of a big stimulus package includes major investments and the structural solutions needed to the housing crisis?
Diane, that's I think a really good question. I think it's one that I would look to you and the 1,200 advocates that are on this call, because you're right. Traditionally, we've not viewed that in the classic kind of government definition of infrastructure. Heck, it's been hard to get the feds and to even view broadband as an infrastructure piece. But you would have my support on making that case, and I would like to. I'd like to be an advocate for that. And I'm particularly thinking about, new construction on low income, because again, what I've learned over the years is, we've done so very little truly low income. We've done working family housing, but we've not really done much new low income housing, and how we can make that, how we can make that part of the package. And I see here that from Mr. Huggins on the chat line, and a very good point there of housing repair, that repairing existing housing stock oftentimes could be even cheaper than building new. So that is a valid point as well. And I do think that some of this could potentially be around direct funding, but some of this needs to be potentially expanded use of tax financing tools as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good segue in a moment to Chairwoman Waters, who has a bill called the Housing Infrastructure Act in the House, which would provide $70 billion for public housing repair and additional funding for new construction, as you're saying, of affordable housing to low-income people through the National Housing Trust Fund. So we'll look forward to working with you, Senator Warner, both on this COVID relief package and on the next big spending package.
Can I just
to advance housing justice, and we really appreciate your work on it.
I appreciate that, Diane. And before you go to Chair Waters, let me just add one other thing.
Yes.
That Chair Waters was she's been really the leader, and I was her wingman on this in the last COVID package. But one of the things that COVID has exposed is the enormous disparities in this country in terms of access to capital. We've seen 440,000 Black businesses close because they didn't get as much access to the PPP funding, not having as much traditional banking relationships. But Maxine and I were able to work together and secure $12 billion for minority depository institutions, Black-owned banks, and CDFIs, community development financial institutions. $3 billion of that will be in direct grants, but $9 billion of that will go in as tier one capital. That can be leveraged into $90 billion of additional lending capacity into CDFIs and MDIs. That will increase the lending capacity of these, roughly 1,400, I believe, institutions around the country, CDFIs, by about 50%. So it's not going to address every problem. It's not going to address complete systemic racism, inequities on access to capital. But this Jobs and Neighborhood Assistance Act that was put into I was proud of working with Maxine to get into the COVID bill, could have one of the most substantial, if we get it implemented the right way, some of the most substantial upgrades in access to capital. And a lot of that is everybody on this call knows better than I. A lot of those CDFI institutions work with you at the local level and communities across the country on access to housing. So a good piece of news that hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet, but working with Chair Waters, we hope to really get out and into the bloodstream in a very progressive way. So thank you very much, Diane, and appreciate the chance to be with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Senator Warner. Really appreciate your work and appreciate you joining the call today.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, now I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our next guest speaker, who is Representative Maxine Waters, the Congresswoman from California and the chair of the powerful House Financial Services Committee. And I know that Representative Waters is very well known and loved by many on this call. She has been a staunch advocate and champion throughout her entire career for low-income renters and for people who are homeless. As chair of the committee, she's introduced and advanced bills to invest in solutions, like I just mentioned, the Housing as Infrastructure Act, the Ending Homelessness Act, and many others. And of course, she was our lead House champion in introducing the housing components of the HEROES Act, including the national moratorium on evictions and $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. And it was really her leadership and tenacity that helped ensure that we achieved that extension of the eviction moratorium and a $25 billion in ERA, which she has called a down payment for the additional relief needed, both the short and the long term. So, Congresswoman Waters, I don't know if that's you that's unmuted right now. Hello, Congresswoman Waters. It's such a pleasure to welcome you back to this national call. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of the over 1,200 people on this call and the tens of millions of renters whose lives are better through your work. Just thank you for your tremendous leadership before, during, and after COVID-19. And I'll turn it over to you for your remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much for having me back on this call. And I would like to thank you, Diane Yentl, as the president and CEO of National Low-Income Housing Coalition, for the very warm introduction. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition does such important work advocating for affordable housing for the nation's lowest families. So to all the members, I'd like to convey how appreciative I am for all of your work during this pandemic crisis. It has really made a difference. As many of you know, since the beginning of COVID-19 crisis, I fought for the creation of an emergency rental assistance fund to support families and individuals who are facing eviction after accruing months of back rent they were unable to pay through no fault of their own. So yes, I'm pleased that in the bipartisan legislative package we passed into law, we're finally able to get $25 billion in funding for emergency rental assistance. And I'd like to just thank all of you, all of the members of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, for your work advocating for that funding. but of course the bill must only be a first step. You know, I've been a little bit frustrated in dealing with this housing rental assistance question. First of all, we started back with the HEROES Act. Well, we started with CARES, and we, had $50 billion that we wanted. We couldn't even get into CARES. And then, of course, we finally got into HEROES with $25 billion. And I'm so pleased that the president is now offering another $25 billion. And I'm very pleased about that. It's been a long time in coming, and it is very desperately needed. And I'm worried about all of the states and the systems that they're putting up and how this money is going to be put in the hands of our renters and, of course, many of our small landlords who have been, waiting as we have continued to extend the moratorium. So this has been an issue that I think certainly we've been too long in taking care of. And of course, I hear stories about how some of the landlords are already evicting, no matter that the eviction moratorium has been extended. And so this is something we have to stay on top of, and we have to understand that more money is going to be needed, and we're going to have to continue to fight for rental assistance. It has been projected that we may reach about 500,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the U.S. next month, and families and individuals across the country continue to struggle to try and make ends meet. And so more assistance certainly will be needed. And I'm thankful that President Biden and his administration are now offering a real leadership and have a strong plan to tackle the crisis. His plan, of course, calls for a new round of stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment benefits, as well as that additional $25 billion I just alluded to for emergency rental assistance and funding for homeless assistance. So as chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, I'm committed to working every single day to ensure that vulnerable families have the relief and assistance that they really need. This Congress, I will also continue to prioritize my legislation to tackle the homelessness crisis, the Ending Homelessness Act, and my bill to provide robust funding for our nation's housing infrastructure, the Housing is Infrastructure Act. And I'm very hopeful that with the leadership of the Biden administration and Democrats now in control of the U.S. Senate, we will be able to finally advance meaningful solutions to the homelessness crisis and housing affordability crisis in law. So I'm thankful to all of you, but, I wish I could tell you that I am absolutely comfortable that we're on our way to realizing some of our goals in relationship to housing and low-income housing and homelessness. Housing is infrastructure for public housing, all of that. But we're going to have to continue to fight. We're going to have to continue to fight for it. I know right now that we have, individuals from the Senate and the House working on with the administration in trying to, as they call it, target. And they said that they see in the president's legislation items for funding that they think do not necessarily need to be there, and that they're going to be fighting and working together in a bipartisan way for targeting. Now, I'm not involved in that at this point. And as you know, when we talk about what is needed and what is not needed, it causes me a bit of concern because we need so much for the suffering families in this country who have been, not only without, safe and secure place to live and not being able to pay their rent and looking forward every day to us to solve the problem. We have so much hunger, that everybody now is witnessing with the food lines and people trying to stand in line to have food to put on the table for their families. And while this is not a housing issue, it is a housing issue. It's all related to housing. And so I'm absolutely focused on that. And I'd just like to say that whether or not we're talking about housing for, the poorest of our society, public housing, there are some issues that are not addressed in the president's initiative that I think I still want to pay attention to. And I will, join the discussion on these issues, such as homeowner assistance. Homeowner assistance is not identified in this package. And I want more Section 8 vouchers. And I want to make sure that, of course, we're dealing with our students. And as the senator said, we have been working on PPP, and we've been working on the MDIs, that is, the Minority Depository Institution, and the CDFIs. And that seems to get more attention in a bipartisan way. The focus kind of on, business. And of course, access to capital is a real problem. But both Democrats and Republicans seem to come together a bit more when we're talking about small business and PPP and all of that. And that's needed, but we cannot let anything supersede our need to direct more resources, as many as we possibly can gather and put together for housing. I don't have my numbers with me now about how much housing is needed in this country. It is substantial, the need for affordable housing. And so this is at the top of my agenda, along with a focus on homelessness and trying my best to get rid of homelessness forever. And so I appreciate you. Without you, I would not be able to do what we've been able to do thus far in addressing this housing issue. But we've got to put a lot more attention, and we've got to ask for a lot more money. Yes, we cannot do this on the cheap. And so whether it's the Housing Trust Fund or it's Section 8 vouchers or it's rental or it's homeowner assistance, all of it is on my radar. And I thank you for being there with me. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'd love to take them from you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Representative Waters. And we are with you on all of those fights. Certainly agree with the need for what Joe Biden has proposed, and agree with you that still more is needed on top of that for vouchers and assistance for people experiencing homelessness, and your legislation on housing and infrastructure and ending homelessness acts and beyond. So how can we, with all of that together and keeping in mind, the president's commitment to universal voucher assistance that he ran on as a candidate and now is committed to carrying through, how can we achieve that? And how will you prioritize your work forward to get us towards universal housing assistance?
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just say that one of the things that I'm trying to do, and it gets a little bit political, is this. I want to give all of the support that I and we can give to the president in this huge job that he has and tackling the trauma of COVID-19. And so in doing with that, I want to work closely with them. And I don't want to look as if I'm just starting out to, beat upon the president and not be appreciative for what he's done. And so I'm very cognizant and very aware of what we need to do in cooperating and working with the president. But I'm also aware that we have to continue to educate and to insist on universal assistance, as you have just identified. And we have to understand that we must, keep out there the need for housing assistance and affordable housing assistance and what its cost is. And while there are those who, perhaps, believe that, we're forever asking for too much money, we've got to find a way to work with them, but not back down. We can't back down. And so what we must do is continue to educate, to work, to push, and show support for the president. And I'm going to work very hard at doing that because I think that it is important for us to give him the opportunity, but it is important for us also to make sure that the need is understood by everybody and that it is at the top of the agenda. And I have to tell you that, of course, a rental assistance, because of COVID-19 and the situation that so many of our renters find themselves in and so worried about evictions and our continued need to, extend the moratorium and all that, which makes everybody uncomfortable. I'm going for it on homelessness big time. The homelessness in this country is intolerable and unconscionable. And during COVID-19, it has become even worse. It was a huge problem before COVID-19. It has been exacerbated by COVID-19. And so that's high on my agenda, dealing with the homelessness, housing as infrastructure, Section 8, and all that we can do to move toward universal housing assistance.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Chairwoman Waters, that this is our moment to, achieve many of the things that you have been fighting for your whole career, and having you as chair of the House Financial Services Committee in this moment is very reassuring and exciting. And we are here to support you in all of these efforts, and so appreciative for your leadership and your commitment to ending homelessness and ending housing poverty. And as always, so glad to have you join this call. So thank you so much, Representative Waters.
Well, thank you so much for organizing this call. And I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. And I look forward to our continued struggle to deal with the housing crisis in this country. Thank you so very much.
We look forward to it too. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman. Take care.
All right, goodbye.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, wonderful to have Chairwoman Waters back and to have Senator Warner join us to talk about all of the work that we have ahead. Certainly a lot of just tremendous challenges, but equally tremendous opportunities. So I think it's an exciting moment. So I am going to go back now to talk about some of the updates that we wanted to share. We are going to share some updates on the latest executive orders and actions that have already come from the Biden administration and that are coming soon. And we'll talk briefly about the executive order extending the eviction moratorium. We'll talk about emergency rental assistance, what's happening at the Department of Treasury. We'll talk about an exciting update from FEMA and what's next, and briefly some other executive actions. And then we'll turn to our field updates, which we have a lot of very good field updates today. So I talked at the beginning of the call about the executive order on the eviction moratorium. I'm not going to repeat all of that in the interest of time, but just as a reminder, President Biden on his first day did sign the executive order directing the CDC director to extend the eviction moratorium through at least March 31st. And she put out a statement that day on January 20th, saying that she will do exactly that. It hasn't yet been published in the Federal Register. It should be published any day. And as soon as it is, certainly we'll send it out to everyone. But a reminder that the eviction moratorium that has been extended is the existing moratorium, which all of us on this call know has flaws and shortcomings. And we are certainly continuing to urge that the Biden administration improve the moratorium, strengthen it, and enforce it. And to that end, I have been told by people in the White House that their intention is to start a process to gather input on the improvements that are needed to the moratorium. They are well aware that improvements are needed. So we have sent a letter, and Elena has put it in the chat box. The National Income Housing Coalition, National Housing Law Project are together sent a letter to the CDC director asking for a meeting as soon as possible to talk about the improvements that are needed to the moratorium and to continue urging her to make those changes as soon as possible. Certainly she has a lot of things that she needs to prioritize right now. She is well aware of the need for changes to the moratorium. I think we'll just need to keep encouraging and pushing to ensure that this remains a top priority and gets done quickly. And also just to note again that the extension is at least through March 31st. So both the president and the CDC director certainly left themselves room to extend it further. And as you know, President Biden in his proposal to Congress is urging that Congress extend it through the end of September. So we're not done yet with this eviction moratorium, but we are certainly off to a good start with having this extension signed. Okay, then I want to talk about the emergency rental assistance, the $25 billion that was already enacted in the COVID relief package in December. And we talked on our last call last Tuesday, it was Tuesday morning on the last day of the Trump administration, that the Department of Treasury put out a very problematic FAQ on how those emergency rental assistance dollars could be used at the state and local level. And we talked at length on the last week's call about the problems with the executive order. With the FAQ the Treasury had put out. And so we quickly put those concerns that we have into a letter. We sent the letter on Thursday to President Biden, to Secretary-designate Yellen and Secretary-designate Fudge, urging them to rescind or revise that FAQ, to align it with the statute and to simplify and make sure that those funds get out to the tenants who need it the most to prevent evictions. So I'm actually going to see if Sarah Sadian wants to share any highlights from that letter or our concerns in that Treasury FAQ. Sarah, you want to add on?
Sure, this is Sarah. Just a couple of things to point out of what our top concerns were. I think overall we were worried that additional burdensome documentation requirements would make it harder to serve the lowest income and most marginalized households. One, because it would mean that they'd have to turn in more paperwork and meet more hoops in order to receive assistance, but also because those documentation requirements would slow down the process and make it more time consuming before they can get the assistance that they need. We're also concerned, in addition to that, that they excluded really needed internet and telephone utilities, and that they failed to collect important information that's needed to make sure that state and local governments are complying with the statute and that all households are being served. And I know that Elena shared a copy of the link to the letter in the chat box in case people have other questions about the issues that we're pushing for.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yes, and just to be clear, the FAQ is a document on frequently asked questions, and so it's a way that Treasury is starting to put out guidance on the uses of the emergency rental assistance. And as Sarah said, it's very problematic, this first set of guidance. So we sent that letter. I did have a conversation with some people in the administration. I know that they are aware of some of these problems and just how widely agreed it is that these pieces are very problematic. And I know that they're giving serious consideration to adjusting in some way some of those answers that were in that FAQ. And we are urging that they do so and that they do it as soon as possible, because we are very concerned about program administrators starting to use some of this problematic guidance. So they need to really replace it as soon as possible, and we'll keep pushing with the hopes that they do. And Elena has put into the chat box links to all of these documents that we are referencing, both the FAQ from Treasury and the letter that we sent. Okay, we also had really good news last week when President Biden signed an executive order related to COVID relief and FEMA reimbursement for very broad COVID relief, including non-congregate sheltering of people experiencing homelessness. So I am going to turn it over to Noah Patton from NLIHC to share an update on that executive order. Noah?
Thanks, Diane. So last week, President Biden signed an executive order directing FEMA to fully reimburse the cost of approved non-congregate sheltering in hotel and motels across the country. This includes sheltering for folks experiencing homelessness, as well as residents of congregate living facilities. FEMA usually has reimbursed these expenses at 75% through its public assistance program. That public assistance the PA program typically offers states and local governments, as well as eligible nonprofits, reimbursement for things like infrastructure repair, debris removal, emergency response, and protective measures. But for this pandemic, the agency included housing folks in non-congregate sheltering, so hotel rooms and things like that. And many thanks to FEMA for the decision to allow that. So President Biden's executive order bumped up the amount of reimbursement for that approved sheltering to 100% through September 30th. In addition, the order permits FEMA to pay in advance a percentage of the costs related to non-congregate sheltering. We'll need to wait for further guidance from FEMA before we know what that percentage will be, but that's just a very good sign that FEMA will be getting money out the door in anticipation of non-congregate sheltering costs. Just since I've seen a lot of questions online about non-congregate sheltering, just wanted to give a quick overview of the setup. Typically, it's when a state or local government will allocate funding to a local nonprofit or agency to run non-congregate sheltering out of a hotel using budget or other assistance funds. That state or local government will then turn around to be reimbursed by FEMA. The entire country has it, and all you need in order to receive the FEMA approval is a public health order directing non-congregate sheltering for folks experiencing homelessness, as well as your state or local government to formally request approval for those for the reimbursement from FEMA. And then you need to go through the entire reimbursement process as well. So it ranges on who's actually eligible for this non-congregate sheltering. It depends on which state and which FEMA region you'll be dealing with. Some states have had a very wide eligibility, and others it's been solely folks that have been exposed to COVID or have tested COVID positive or are medically at risk. So regardless, if you're interested in learning more about this non-congregate sheltering, FEMA reimbursement, or other FEMA minutia, you can get involved and participate in our weekly Working with FEMA group, which meets via Zoom every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And I'll make sure a link gets into the chat box so you can sign up for those calls. And I think that's about it, Diane.
Great, thanks, Noah. Yeah, it's just tremendously good news for all of the communities that have already been using non-congregate sheltering to move people experiencing homelessness out of shelters, out of encampments, into hotel rooms, but have been now running out of funds to be able to continue that and have actually been starting to wind down those programs. Now they can have the assurance that they will have the money to cover the entirety of the eligible costs for this through the end of the summer, through September. And for the communities who never did this during the pandemic, despite the need, that now there's really an opportunity for advocates to push harder to really urge local communities to take advantage of the fact that the federal government is going to pay 100% of the costs to move eligible people into hotels and motels, and they ought to do it. It'll save lives. So I would also just call out some really helpful papers, memos, and reports that Noah and Elena and Sarah have written during the pandemic on non-congregate sheltering and working with FEMA to do it. There's been at least 3 reports over the last several months, and I'll ask one of the team to put that in the chat box so you can take a look at those and learn more about non-congregate sheltering and what opportunity this executive order offers communities now. And then just very briefly to say that there were an additional 2 executive orders that I want to call out. One that President Biden signed directing federal agencies to protect LGBTQ people from discrimination to the full extent of the law. And another executive order that was also signed on the first day that was titled an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, that undoes the Trump order that banned racial equity training and analysis and launches an administration-wide review of opportunities to advance equity for people in historically marginalized communities. Really important actions taken already by the president. And I will just also, before I turn now to our field updates, there's a lot of questions coming in, and the NLIHC team is doing a great job of answering them via the chat and Q&A box. But just to call out one question that was asked about whether, many of you are some of those 2,000 organizations that joined NLIHC in signing a letter first to Congress, then to the Trump administration CDC director, and then to President-elect Biden, urging that the eviction moratorium be extended, strengthened, and enforced. And so just to assure you all that we have sent that letter, and in fact, we sent it to her before she was CDC director, but we have sent that to the incoming CDC director, Director Walensky. And with the letter that NLIHC and National Housing Law Project sent requesting the meeting, we again sent that letter. So there's no need for you all to sign on to another letter. She has it. And we will keep you all posted on anything that we hear back from them. Okay, and then so I will continue to look through, and the team will continue to look through some of these questions, and we'll answer them as we go. But I'm going to turn now to the first of our field updates, which will be Kathy Alderman, who's Vice President of Communications and Public Policy at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. So Kathy, thanks for joining, and I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. And my apologies for not being able to join you last week. But I've been working with the NLIHC team on a lot of these issues, and just want to, huge shout out to them for all the good news that's coming out, especially on the non-congregate shelter, which I know is going to make a huge difference for people that are living in motels and hotels during this time. But I was asked actually to update folks on an effort that we've undertaken in Colorado in order to ensure people experiencing homelessness and the providers that are serving them are eligible and prioritized for the vaccine. So in early October, our governor sent a plan to CDC on the prioritization for who was going to be eligible and who was going to be prioritized in the state of Colorado for the vaccine. And in that initial plan, people experiencing homelessness and providers were included in the second tiered priority, and they were specifically included. And then as we got closer to seeing the vaccine become available in early December, the Department of Public Health in Colorado and the governor's office released a new plan that had completely taken out people experiencing homelessness. And we believe that this happened as a result of some controversy that was going on publicly about whether people who were in the criminal justice system, primarily jails and prisons, were going to be prioritized for the vaccine. And after a lot of kind of public criticism for initially prioritizing those individuals, the governor decided to put those individuals into the general public prioritization. And with that effort, it appears that all people living in congregate settings other than assisted living facilities were kind of deprioritized. And so obviously this was very concerning to us and concerning to the providers who are on the front lines every day, seeing people experiencing homelessness and making sure they have a safe place to be. we reached out to the governor's office through a letter, through our Homelessness Leadership Council in Denver, and eventually with the sign-on of about 900 individuals and organizations across the state to revise that prioritization and make sure that people that are forced to live in congregate settings, like people experiencing homelessness, are prioritized. And equally as important, the people that are serving them are prioritized for the vaccine, because without staff, our shelters can't stay open. And I know many of you are probably experiencing that today. We had some shelters where the rate of COVID among staff was upwards of 23 and 25%. And so these shelters were running on, lower levels of staffing than they're used to. Obviously, getting volunteers in this time is difficult. And frankly, people serving people experiencing homelessness should be prioritized. They are frontline providers. They are operating as emergency response providers. They're operating oftentimes as healthcare providers. And again, they're seeing, thousands of people every single day. After some discussions back and forth, the governor's office did come out with some new priorities that moved people that are providers in shelters where people are experiencing homelessness up into our first level of prioritization. So in our one level of prioritization, but under a dotted line, meaning that healthcare providers, people in assisted living facilities, and people over the age of 70 would need to be vaccinated first. However, there was still no mention of people experiencing homelessness. And so we continue to do advocacy with the governor's office to make sure that folks, again, that are forced to live in these congregate settings are prioritized. And the response that we've received is, well, many people experiencing homelessness are over the age categorization, which was moved down to 65 years of age, which is true. And that many people have high risk health conditions. And so they would likely be prioritized in that second tier as well, which is also true. However, it doesn't make sense to set up a vaccine clinic in a shelter and pick and choose who gets vaccinated and who doesn't get vaccinated. Because we know they're all sharing the same space, they're all sharing the same air, the restrooms, eating facilities, et cetera. And so we continue to do advocacy to say, we need to keep shelters open by making sure that the providers, the direct service providers, are vaccinated and can come to work. But we also need to make sure that all of those people that are living in this congregate setting, whether or not they have a high risk condition or meet an age requirement, are prioritized for the vaccine. Because if we have an outbreak in a shelter, it is much more difficult to contain, and the impacts are going to be much more detrimental than having an outbreak, for instance, at a grocery store, where you can control for that. So we continue that advocacy. I know that many states have prioritized people experiencing homelessness and service providers for the vaccine. As more vaccine becomes available, we really hope that those prioritizations and the vaccine supply will be opened up to people in congregate settings. And I'd be happy to, talk to anybody about how the advocacy was done and what, data points we used and who we reached out to. If that is interesting, I'll put my email my email's on the screen, so you have it. And that's the story of vaccines in Colorado for people experiencing homelessness.
That's really great and helpful, Kathy. We have had a lot of questions from people on previous calls about this exact question. How do we make sure that people experiencing homelessness are prioritized in this way? So thanks for sharing the great work that you did on this. And if you have anything written on the advocacy or specifics on your asks, I think that would be really helpful to others in other states who are trying to do the same thing that you've done. So if you do, and you could share it either in the chat or the Q&A, or send it to us and we'll send it out, I think that would be really helpful for groups too.
Or I'd be happy to send the letter that we sent to the governor and some of the news articles that we were quoted in about this prioritization level.
That'd be great. We'll send that out widely. Thanks so much, Kathy. Okay, I'll turn now to our next field update, which comes from Kendra Knighton, from a policy associate with the Idaho Asset Building Network and Idaho Voice for Children. Kendra, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Diane. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kendra Knighton, and I'm a policy associate with Idaho Voices for Children and the Idaho Asset Building Network. Idaho Voices for Children is a policy advocacy organization based out of Boise, Idaho, that champions policies that ensure every child has the opportunity to thrive. and the Idaho Asset Building Network is a project of Idaho Voices for Children. 3 years ago, as a cohort member of the NLIHC's Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, we began to build a really phenomenal multi-sector housing coalition that specifically focused on housing issues and housing advocacy here in Idaho. And although our work was traditionally focused on federal advocacy, our work has shifted over the past year to include state and local level as we have engaged in advocacy related to pandemic response. Right now, our focus is primarily on state level advocacy while the Idaho State Legislature is convened for their 2021 legislative session. Although it should be noted that Idaho's legislature is deeply conservative and unfamiliar with housing policy, the pandemic has been a time where policymakers have acknowledged the urgent needs in our area, and we are hopeful this realization could produce more advances in housing policy for low-income families. With this in mind, our current state level goals include ensuring federal emergency rental assistance is made available quickly and equitably, supporting the passage of pro-tenant legislation, and educating state lawmakers about the housing landscape in Idaho. During this past summer, we and our housing coalition urged Governor Little to allocate a share of Idaho's coronavirus relief fund dollars to provide emergency rental assistance to Idaho's renters impacted by the coronavirus. And to our surprise, and frankly our delight, he approved $15 million in rental assistance that was administered by the Idaho Housing and Finance Association. Overall, the IHFA did an excellent job of standing up and administering a brand new program. But in hindsight, there were some lessons learned about how the program could have been administered more equitably. For example, we know that outreach for the initial program did not reach many of the folks who needed assistance most, and we received feedback from many of our coalition members that the application process itself was overly burdensome and acted as a barrier to many of the folks who wanted to apply for assistance but were unable to. With the new federal funding coming into the state, we are encouraging the IHFA to implement new policies and procedures that would help to bridge that gap and ensure the folks who need rental assistance the most are able to access it. We also recently learned that this round of federal funding for emergency rental assistance will require legislative approval, which was not required the first time. Since this is a new program here in Idaho, we simply don't know where a lot of our lawmakers stand when it comes to housing policy, rental assistance, and their general willingness to accept new federal dollars. So to help ensure these funds are made available as quickly as possible, we are doing outreach with our lawmakers to provide basic education about the housing landscape in Idaho, how Idaho's renters are being impacted by the pandemic, and encouraging them to approve the use of these dollars quickly. We also anticipate at least a couple pieces of housing-related legislation being introduced this legislative session. One bill would entitle tenants to a walkthrough with their landlord or property manager upon move-in and move-out, and the other will implement a 3-day late payment grace period for renters. Similar legislation that was introduced in previous years had been met with resistance by Republican lawmakers. So our multi-sector housing coalition will advocate for these pieces of legislation and continue to educate our lawmakers on housing issues during an upcoming Housing Day of Action we are hosting at the beginning of February. Finally, another issue we are keeping our eye on is the Idaho legislature's current movement to pass a concurrent resolution that would immediately end the governor's emergency declaration issued in response to the pandemic. The end of this declaration would result in FEMA funding and assistance received throughout Idaho being put in jeopardy, including funding the city of Boise has been pre-approved to use to cover monthly homelessness expenses for non-congregate sheltering. Ending the governor's emergency declaration will also hinder the state's ability to distribute and administer coronavirus vaccines throughout the state. So with that, I'd just like to take a moment to thank Diane and the rest of the NLIHC team for the opportunity to join this week's call, and also for the amazing work that you all do. So thanks again, Diane, and I will hand it back over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Kendra. I appreciate all the great work that you're doing, and I appreciate you sharing it on today's call. I haven't seen any questions come in, but hopefully you can stick around for the rest of the call and answer some questions if they come in via the chat or the Q&A box. So thanks so much, Kendra.
Thanks, Diane. I'm happy to stay on to answer questions.
Great. All right, and I will turn now to our next field update, which comes from J.R. Fleming, who's the Executive Director of the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. J.R., I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi there. Yeah, this is J.R. Fleming. Thanks, Diane, and everybody for having us. Give me 1 second. There's some music going in the background. Okay. Thanks for having us. We have some brief updates. Thanks to you guys pushing nationally, we was able to use some of your templates to push our local government to take necessary steps to extend our eviction moratorium. So in Illinois, with the help and assistance of about 14 nonprofits, our Cook County commissioners, we was able to get the governor's office to extend the moratorium to February 6th. It's going to roll month by month with an extension. Our city has a backup plan to when eviction moratorium does end. They've been providing over $13 million in rental assistance thus far on the city level, same with the county. Our county has put together what we call just housing legislation that deals with equitable housing in a sense of not just evictions, but affordability. On a state level, we're struggling, to get a long-term extension for the moratorium due to the push by private landlords. There has been, how can we say it, numerous cases of illegal lockouts. I guess there was a lot of confusion around the eviction moratorium. One with that, but there's been a lot of organizing efforts going on locally, not just with community organizations and activists, but as well as our city and county officials to make sure we got legislation in place and resources in place and providing eviction moratorium, rental assistance, and relocation assistance. So once again, we're just happy that we have seen some things as of late that has relaxed folks, but we're still looking for additional federal resources that might help address the eventual eviction crisis that is sure to happen. Now, that's what we had in terms of what we've been doing with government. Now, as organization, the Anti-Eviction Campaign has been providing, thanks to some assistance from National Low Income Housing Coalition, SBA, and 2 other foundations, we were able to rehab 3 homes, 2 of which is incomeless housing. So it's been transitional housing for 2 homeless families. And one of our units, we were able to subsidize our tenants since they moved in as of last March of last year with rent-free rental due to the COVID-19 crisis. We're still looking forward to doing more work federally with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and some of their vacant unit in HUD, so that we can turn some of the distressed and vacant property into what we call transitional housing, emergency shelter, and low-income rentals. And that's the update we have out of Chicago.
That's great. Thanks so much, JR. You're doing such great work. I appreciate your leadership in Chicago and throughout the state of Illinois, and I appreciate you sharing your updates on today's call. Thanks so much for joining, JR.
You're welcome.
All right, now I'm going to answer some of the questions that have come in about kind of next steps on some of the pieces that we've already talked about. But first, I want to turn it over to Sarah Sadian, our VP of Public Policy, to talk about the latest from Capitol Hill and what's happening with the COVID relief package and beyond. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Diane. It's hard to believe that it was less than a week ago that President Trump and Vice President Harris were sworn in. There's a lot that has happened since, and so I want to give folks a brief update about what we expect in the coming weeks and months. So last week, not only were the Vice President and President sworn in, but so were Democratic senators who won their most recent elections, and that officially shifted control of the Senate to Democrats and elevated Senator Chuck Schumer to be the Senate Majority Leader. There's been some delays, though, in what congressional committees have been able to do since then. They are still negotiating, Schumer, I should say, and now Minority Leader Mitch McConnell are still negotiating an agreement about how to share power in this 50-50 split in the Senate. And without an agreement, technically Democrats are still in the majority, but the rules of many committees are operating under the old set of rules, which basically prevents the committees from now taking up legislation. So we know that they're working very quickly to try to reach an agreement on that. In terms of timing, we know that some priorities have been shifting around. There's been a delay to the impeachment process. And in the meantime, or overlapping with that, we expect Democrats to focus on confirming as many nominees as possible and then shifting their attention quickly to COVID response. In terms of nominees, we know that there will be a vote as early as tonight on Treasury Secretary nominee Janet Yellen, at which point we'll be able to follow up with her again about the guidance that Diane and I spoke about earlier on the call. Also on Thursday, the Banking Committee is holding a hearing to discuss the nomination of Marcia Fudge as the HUD Secretary nominee. We have submitted our comments to, or our questions to, committee members, and we hope they will ask her about different areas of her priorities as HUD Secretary. In terms of COVID, we also heard from Senator Mark Warner about a group of bipartisan senators who met with the Biden administration over the weekend to discuss Biden's $1.9 billion COVID relief package. This effort is, just the latest evidence that Biden wants to see if there's a path forward to passing COVID relief with bipartisan support, although many people on the Hill are acknowledging that they may very well need to shift their focus to using budget reconciliation if that's needed. Budget reconciliation is a legislative tool that allows the Senate to pass bills with just a simple majority rather than 60 votes. But it is much more limited in scope about what could be included in that. So far, it sounds like Republicans have largely scoffed at the $1.9 billion package, saying that it's too expensive. They're encouraging Democrats to focus on maybe smaller individual pieces of COVID relief rather than a comprehensive package, though that also seems unlikely because Democrats see that as undermining their leverage if they were to pull off those pieces. Either way, whether they go about it through a bipartisan approach or through budget reconciliation, we do know that the timeline for passing the next round of COVID relief is due by mid-March. That's when unemployment benefits that were extended in the December package would expire. We also know that if that's the case, if Democrats do have to pass something by mid-March, they're going to have to start working quickly on a process to use budget reconciliation, and that might happen simultaneously as trying to see whether or not a bipartisan approach would work. It does take a little bit of time to use budget reconciliation. Under that process, first, the Senate and the House would have to pass what's called a budget resolution that gives instructions to each committee about the legislation they would need to put together. Then each committee would put together that legislation. It would be packaged together, and both the House and Senate would have to pass it. It would have to be scored, which means that the CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office, would have to determine how much it costs. And there would be lots of fights about whether or not particular provisions follow the rules for budget reconciliation or not. All of that takes a lot of time. And so we expect them to start working on that process in the coming week or two. In terms of a larger stimulus package, I know that committees are starting to look at that and think about what their priorities are. We haven't yet heard any details on or formal announcements about what should be included, although we do expect to hear announcements soon from the White House about what their priorities will be in that infrastructure stimulus package. And then finally, in terms of appropriations, I think we've mentioned this before, but this year's budget will be the first in a decade where Congress was not limited by spending caps that were required by the Budget Control Act. those spending caps made it very difficult for Congress to fund housing programs and other programs at the scale necessary. So we're hoping to see a really robust investment of housing through the appropriations process. We've heard that President Biden might release what's called a skinny budget request sometime in February or March, and then follow that up with a full budget request, but that wouldn't come until about late April, maybe early May, in which case we would expect to see the appropriations committees starting to mark up their bills somewhere between late May and early June. Of course, that's all assuming that they stay on schedule, and there's a lot to get done between now and then. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Diane.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah, for that update. And Sarah, remind me so that I can remind everybody what time the policy working group calls are on Tuesdays. Is it 12 or 12:30?
At 12:30 every Tuesday.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Right. So everything that we talked about on today's call it's a lot of information. It's hard to keep track of it all. And just a reminder that these national calls are meant to share all of it at a high level. And then throughout the week, we have working group calls, which allow for a lot more opportunity to dig in and have conversation and answer many questions about and share lessons learned about all of this. So related to the updates that Sarah just gave, if you want to get more involved in everything that's happening now related to our policy priorities for the next COVID relief package and beyond, please join the policy working group calls that are every Tuesday at 12:30. And if you want to talk more, learn more, share more about non-congregate sheltering for people experiencing homelessness and how to be reimbursed by FEMA for that work, please join the calls, the working group calls that we have every Tuesday at 3 o'clock that we call the Working with FEMA calls. And I would say too that there have been questions put in the Q&A in the chat box around, can that money be used for acquisition? What are the eligibility around using those funds? Will FEMA provide any guidance? Noah, who leads that team on Tuesdays, will dig into all of that. So please join that Working with FEMA call. But I will say that we have heard that FEMA does intend to put out guidance soon, hopefully as soon as this week, on the new reimbursement policy for non-congregate sheltering. So FEMA working with FEMA calls Tuesdays at 3. Then we have lots of questions about the emergency rental assistance that's already been appropriated by Congress, the $25 billion, to talk in much more depth about how those funds are being utilized, the guidance that's coming out from Treasury, what more we need, etc. Join our calls on Wednesdays, every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, which is our state and local implementation working group. And we'll talk in much more depth about all of those issues on those calls. Also to say, we have put a lot of links in the Q&A and the chat box. Thanks as always to the NLIHC team for getting it all in there really quickly and effectively. But also to say, we've had a lot of questions about how to save the chat box, to save all of those links. Don't worry too much about that. As long as you're on our email list, you will get, as follow-up to this call, all of the links that we've referenced. So if there's one link that you want to take away from this call, it's the link for how to sign up to make sure that you're on the list to get all of our updates. And I'll ask somebody from the NLIHC team to put that in the chat box now. I think they have already. And I think that's it for now. So we've gotten through the whole agenda, lots of information, lots more to come. We're waiting on the FEMA guidance. We'll share that as soon as we have it. We're waiting on hopefully an updated Treasury FAQ and or guidance. We'll share that as soon as we have it. And we're waiting on a meeting or further direction from the CDC director on extending the eviction moratorium. And of course, we'll share that as soon as we have it. And we're waiting on Congress to get working on the next COVID relief package. And we'll have plenty of work to do there once they do. So thanks again, everybody, for joining today's call. We'll talk to you all soon. Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.